Denji is a character that many people don't think is very good. Some sum him up as just a moron who wants to fondle breasts, or as a comic character, while others say that Chainsaw Man is carried far more by the other characters, like Aki, Makima, Power, etc., than by its protagonist. And of course I disagree. I think Denji is a character who, despite his simplicity, is much deeper than you might think at first glance, and who brings to the work a whole host of super interesting reflections, notably on the question of happiness. All this with a relevant and well-written evolution. In short, it's to show you all this that I decided to make this video. And as with previous Chainsaw Man reviews, we're going to spoil all of the part 1 and nothing of the part 2, since it hasn't even started as I write this video. From the very first pages of the manga, Fujimoto manages to explain Denji very clearly. He's a kid who has to pay off the debt his father owed to the mafia because his father is dead. It's a debt that's impossible to repay, and which, in the end, is nothing more than a pretext for being exploited by the mobsters. A completely unfair situation, but a situation against which Denji doesn't rebel. Indeed, he's a docile guy who never raises his voice, as the mobster says. He just obeys like a lapdog, because he's sure he'll never get away with it anyway. As he said to Pochita, "For us, a normal life will never be anything more than a dream. I'll never be able to pay off all my debts before I croak." Because yes, Denji does suspect that he's doomed since he has the same symptoms his mother had before she died. In short, Denji is a fatalist, but he can't resist dreaming of a normal life. He's also a boy with enormous empathy, who can't bear to see others die. This is a very classic personality trait for a protagonist, but it's brought out quite subtly in his first encounter with Pochita. When he discovers Pochita, he understands that the latter is about to die. By the way, Pochita is wounded following his fight with Makima, as she will tell us in volume 10. Anyway, at this point, we understand from a single frame in which he thinks of his father hanging, and from the expression on his face that Denji is traumatized by his father's death and doesn't want to see anyone die in front of him. That's why he's going to save Pochita, the Chainsaw Man, by giving him his blood. Even if this almost vigilante aspect isn't emphasized throughout the story, it's still very much present. There are many moments when Denji saves strangers in the heat of the moment, and he even goes so far as to kill Aki to save the lives of the strangers around him, and it's thanks to all these moments that he's acclaimed by the crowd in the final volume. But it's only when we learn the true nature of Denji's father's death that we really understand who Denji was at the beginning of the story. His father was a violent father, probably beating Denji regularly, but like so many other stories of this kind, there came a day when his father went too far, a day when he had been drinking more than usual, a day when Denji had no choice but to fight back, and so ended up killing his own father. This act, even though it was totally legitimate in the circumstances and no one would mourn his alcoholic father, would deeply traumatize him, and his brain, in order to protect his sanity, would erase this memory, would lock him behind this famous door. The door behind which hid his father's corpse, not hanged but sprawled on the floor in a pool of blood, a broken glass bottle beside his skull. And this revelation reveals the origins of many aspects of his personality, attesting to Fujimoto's desire to create believable characters whose personalities are not constructed from scratch, but are the coherent result of the environment in which he grew up. We understand, for example, that his fatalistic, docile, and even completely submissive side inevitably stems from all the mistreatment he suffered at the hands of his father. Because yeah, when your alcoholic father raises you alone and teaches you with his fist to shut up and obey, that no one else is there to show you another vision of the world. Because yes, I remind you that his mother died, and that he never went to school, never had a friend, etc. Well, of course you shut up and obey, without ever thinking for a moment that you could do otherwise. This violent past also explains his half-crazy side when it comes to killing devils, and the years he spent killing devils to pay off his debt when he was just a kid didn't really help in that respect. In short, Denji, at the beginning of the story, is a fatalistic, docile 16-year-old who has never really known happiness and who thinks he never will, who in one corner of his head is a bit of a nutcase and in another corner is very kind. Then comes the moment when the mafia kill him. Pochita will make him a deal. He'll offer him his heart in exchange for the realization of his dream, to have a normal life. After this resurrection, Denji realizes that having Pochita by his side should have been enough, just as the mobsters didn't need any more power, given that their lives were already good enough. He notes that, in the end, you always want more, no matter what your situation, but we'll come back to that later. After slaughtering all the mobsters, Makima appears and pulls Denji out of his situation for good, promising him something to eat in the morning, shaking him out of his fatalism and giving him the chance to live a normal life, to give him a glimmer of hope. This is how the manga really begins. After that, Denji's adventures begin as he sets off in search of a normal life and, more generally, happiness. In fact, he's going to discover a whole host of aspects of the normal life he's fantasized about. But it's not all good, because, as he said before slaughtering the mobsters, you always want more. It's a bit like Plato's image of the pierced barrel actually. In Gorgias, Plato uses the image of the pierced barrel to show that a life in which we only seek to satisfy our desires could not lead us to happiness, because the very nature of desire is to be constantly reborn. Seeking to be happy by accumulating pleasures is in fact like continually filling a leaky barrel, and in the end, the barrel will never be filled and the quest to fill it will be endless. Denji sums it all up perfectly in one page, telling Makima, "I'd touched my finger on a dream I'd been chasing all my life. But when I got my hands on it, I realized that it wasn't nearly as great as I'd hoped. So I said to myself that perhaps, every time I get something I've wanted for a long time, it will be to understand that I was happier when I was chasing it." Moreover, Makima's answer is not to stop wanting to satisfy her desires, nor to tell her that man is in any case eternally unsatisfied, that a normal life is not the key to finding happiness. No, especially not, because Makima wants Denji to seek a normal life, since that's part of her plan. Instead, she's going to give him an even greater desire to fulfill, by making him promise to grant any of her wishes in exchange for removing the gun devil in order to really establish her domination over him. Basically, she's going to turn him into a simp. And this manipulation will continue behind the scenes when she kills Reize, who could have interfered with her plans, given that Denji had fallen in love with her. Anyway, following Makima's advice, Denji will continue to seek satisfaction in fulfilling his desires, and will always be a little disappointed by it. There's his first kiss, for example, which ends not very well. And Makima will make up for it a little later with her lollipop story, just to push him to continue down this path. So all in all, throughout what I called the first part of the manga in my video on the genius of Chainsaw Man, Denji will seek to satisfy his desires while keeping his ultimate goal in sight, defeating the gun devil so that Makima can grant his wish, so that he can realize his greatest desire. We might add to this reflection the Aesop fable about the field rat and the city rat, to which Fujimoto refers throughout the Reize arc, but also in the flashback with Aki's little brother for the anecdote. The field rat lives safely in the countryside but has little to eat, while the city rat will enjoy all the delights the city has to offer, but will have to risk his life every moment to do so. When Reize asks Denji what he thinks, he says he'd rather be a city rat, comforted by Makima's idea of taking risks to satisfy his desires. The discussion itself perfectly sums up Denji's way of thinking. Frankly, it's better to be a country rat, nothing beats peace. Maybe, but in town there's more good stuff. And stuffing your face with it would be enough to keep you happy? Yeah, in a way Reize is convinced by Denji herself, as she risks her life to return to the city to see Denji again. She'll become a city rat for a moment and be killed by Makima. Anyway, I'm sure there's plenty more to be said about this fable, but let's avoid digressing too much this time. In any case, if Denji maintains this line of conduct, it's mainly thanks to something that characterizes him perfectly throughout the manga, and which is even one of its major themes: ignorance. Chainsaw Man is a manga that doesn't take us by the hand and explain everything in detail. Many passages aren't clearly explained, as we can deduce what happened on our own without too much difficulty, even if some remain a little harder to grasp. Take, for example, the gun devil who takes possession of Aki's body. At no point are we given an explanation of how this happened. We can only make assumptions, telling ourselves that Makima did it on purpose to make him get possessed, or that she defeated the gun demon and ordered him to take control of Aki and go kill Denji, always to follow her plan. Anyway, personally it's a style of narration I love because by leaving it up to the reader to fill in the gaps left by the author, it gets the reader's imagination going and makes them even more invested in the story. That's why I find the narration of games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Elden Ring or Hollow Knight so exciting, or that of a manga like Blame, because they really push this aspect to the max, while having a real coherent story in the background of course. But for me, if this aspect is present in Chainsaw Man, albeit to a lesser extent, it's not just to produce this effect for the reader. If Fujimoto plays so much with this lack of information, if he plays so much with our ignorance, it's precisely because Denji, the main character himself, spends almost the entire manga in total ignorance. In fact, he's even more clueless than we are. Most of the information we need to grasp the main plot is given in short chapters, in which Denji is rarely present, and in which by contrast we see Makima a lot. Try reading Chainsaw Man one day, reading only the pages where Denji is present, and you'll see that you won't understand a thing. And this theme of ignorance is linked to that of happiness. This is particularly true in the International Assassins arc with the discussion between Kishibe and Quanshi. Quanshi is going to talk about a TV presenter she used to love, who was suddenly revealed to be full of unpleasant details of her private life, so that Quan Chi is no longer into her, basically. Quan Chi summed it all up by saying, "This girl stayed the same, it's just that something in my brain had changed. The trick to living happily in this world is to remain ignorant and stupid." And that's more or less the direction Denji wants to take himself. Because little by little, he's bound to learn things, not remain ignorant, and that's going to destabilize him. For example, at the moment of the revelation about the Gun Devil, when Aki makes him understand that the Gun Devil will never die, Denji is going to reject this truth outright because it would be tantamount to making Makima's promise to him completely null and void. It would in fact be like nullifying all his efforts, and even denying his whole way of thinking about happiness, since this objective is the basis of everything, that Makima is in fact the basis of everything. She couldn't have lied, otherwise nothing would make sense, and her whole being would be called into question. At that point, Denji had already taken the first step towards voluntary ignorance as a means to happiness, and he would plunge completely into it shortly afterwards, in an attempt to escape despair. Because Denji is going to kill Aki, and then nothing will go right. While he finds himself with everything he wanted in the first place, that is a roof over his head, good food, a TV on which he spends his time playing video games or watching films, power who accompanies him on a daily basis, etc., nothing satisfies him anymore. Suddenly everything he'd hoped for turns out to be in vain, and his whole way of thinking is turned upside down and destroyed. His whole being sinks into despair. He even goes so far as to vomit an ice cream cone, which is probably the most contrary act to his nature. When you consider that he's lived in such misery and hunger that he'll eat anything and everything, and that his body itself has registered, as a survival reflex, the fact of swallowing anything that falls into his mouth, even if it's vomit, hello Himeno, the fact of vomiting up something as good as ice cream is probably the most shocking act Denji can perform, and also a perfect illustration of the shock he's undergoing. It's as if his whole being has been called into question. Symbolically, it couldn't have been stronger, and that's why he asks Makima to become his dog. And that's where we come back to what Quan Chi said to Kishibe. The trick to living happily in this world is to remain ignorant and stupid. That's exactly what Denji will say to Makima. I wish I didn't have to think about anything at all. I used to think the bare minimum to avoid dying day by day, and that was enough for me. But today I'm obliged to think about thousands of things all the time, and it's heavy, it exhausts me. If I hadn't stopped Aki by killing him, a good 100 people would have died. But if I'd kept my cool and thought things through, maybe I'd have found another solution. In the end, maybe Aki died just because I'm a moron. If we'd never gotten close, he'd probably still be here, and I wouldn't still be worrying. I know it's pointless, but from morning to night I rehash these kinds of ideas over and over again. But you're a lot smarter than me, aren't you? So if I obey you without flinching, I won't have to think about anything. Basically, he'd rather be a happy idiot than a sad scholar. It's a bit like the dilemma of choosing between the blue pill and the red pill in the Matrix. Except that here, it's as if Denji wants to enter the Matrix while living in the real world. And making that choice is going to be the worst mistake of all because it's going to lead to Power's death. And after that, Makima will explain everything to him, how she manipulated him to make him happier than when he was with Pochita, how she broke that happiness by blaming Denji, and then remind him that he also killed his own father, throwing his biggest childhood trauma back in his face. Besides, some of you may not have understood why killing his father makes him feel so guilty, given that he was obviously an asshole and that it was self-defense, but I remind you that his father was the only person he knew in the world, and I'm not going to give you a psychology lesson, but it wouldn't be the first time that a child victim of parental violence still loved his father, so there are plenty of psychological mechanisms that explain all this. And in any case, the passage in the first chapter where we sense that his father's death has already traumatized him from the start, even though his brain has made him forget that he's responsible for it, is pretty clear in my opinion. But anyway, Makima is really going to arrange for all these traumatic moments to take place at the same time, all so that Denji's guilt is such that he abandons the idea of having a normal life, thinking he doesn't deserve it, so that he sinks into total despair, breaks the contract with Pochita, and that the real Chainsaw Man reborn. However, Pochita, the real Chainsaw Man, has also changed through contact with Denji, and whereas he was supposed to act as usual, that is save the slightest person who cries out for help and then kill them, he's going to start fulfilling Denji's desires, and so will order a burger, have a date with Kobeni etc., and won't kill her despite her cry for help. That's why we see boxes where Denji as a child recounts his dreams. In fact, we see Pochita's point of view when he was listening to Denji. Anyway, after losing to Makima, Power comes to Denji's rescue. In their very last discussion, Denji will say that it's no longer worth it, that he's had enough, that it's been a dream life, and that besides, there'll be no more power or Aki by his side. He's given up hope of a better life, he's given up the very idea of being happy. So power is going to force his hand with a contract, telling him to find the Blood Devil and become friends with him again. Denji will then be picked up by Kishibe and go into hiding with Kobeni. And that's when Denji truly realizes his mistake, that's when he'll be reborn, that the new Chainsaw Man will be reborn. He's going to realize that, since the beginning of the manga, he's been living in ignorance, that he's never decided anything for himself, that he's spent all his time being manipulated, and that he's been a complete idiot, that even if he was happy about it at the time, in the end it led him to where he is, and that he's lost everything. He finally understands that ignorance wasn't the right way to find happiness after all. And this ties in with what the philosopher John Stuart Mill had to say on the subject. He said, "Few human creatures would consent to be changed into inferior animals on the promise of the largest ration of beastly pleasure. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No learned man to be an ignorant. No man of heart and conscience to be selfish and vile. Even if they had the conviction that the fool, the ignorant or the rascal are, with their respective lots, more completely satisfied than they are with their own. They wouldn't want to exchange what they possess more than they do for the fullest satisfaction of all the desires they have in common." So why did Denji want to become a dog in the first place? Well, as I said with Plato's pierced barrel, and as Denji himself had sensed before Makima came to erase this thought, it's because he confused happiness with satisfaction. John Stuart Mill emphasized this point when he said, "To believe that by showing such a preference, we are sacrificing something of our happiness, is to confuse the two very different ideas of happiness and satisfaction." Unquestionably, the being whose faculties of enjoyment are of an inferior order has the greatest chance of seeing them fully satisfied, whereas a being of high aspirations will always feel that the happiness he can aim for, whatever it may be, the world being made as it is an imperfect happiness. But he can learn to bear what imperfections there are in that happiness, so long as they are bearable, and they will not make him jealous of a being who, in truth, ignores those imperfections but only ignores them because he has no suspicion of the good to which those imperfections are attached. Basically, to give you an easy to understand example, it's a bit like comparing a guy who, for example, only reads One Piece and Demon Slayer, and another who reads hundreds of different mangas. The guy who only reads his two favorite mangas and no others will always be happy, because he'll always like what he reads. On the other hand, if you read hundreds of mangas, you're bound to read a lot of bad ones, some of which you'll hate and which will be a waste of time, and you'll also be frustrated at not having the time to read more. But can we really say that someone who only reads two is happier? Well, no, because among the hundreds of mangas the other person reads, he'll discover far more manga that will leave a lasting impression on him than the guy who only reads his two favorites. And he'll also be able to read One Piece and Demon Slayer and enjoy them. He'll have more experiences than the other guy, and even if he has some bad ones, the quantity of good experiences will be greater. He'll understand this and be able to accept the imperfection of his happiness. As John Stuart Mill summed it up, "It is better to be a dissatisfied man than a satisfied pig. It is better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied fool." But Denji's realization goes further than that, thanks to a simple, strikingly obvious sentence from Kobeni, which she utters in response to Denji's observation. "It's just normal, isn't it? A life without drooling only exists in dreams." And Denji is shocked by this obvious fact because, as he says, his dream was to have a normal life because he thought it would be enough for him to be happy. It was literally his goal. But he realizes that he had it all wrong, that it was his desire for a normal life, where you let yourself be carried along by events and are passive, that had turned him into a manipulable ignoramus. That in truth, if he wants a happy life, he has to take charge of his own life, make his own choices and want more than the little he's been offered, the exact opposite of what he's been doing throughout the manga. And it's at this point that he finally wants to become a hero, to become the Chainsaw Man. Not to act as a vigilante or anything, but to satisfy his own desires, to go beyond his condition, to be more than a man in fact, to not have a normal life. He realizes, you might say, that it's better to be a dissatisfied Chainsaw Man than a satisfied dog, to quote John Stuart Mill. Moreover, the fact that it's Kishibe who comes to his aid, even though he was against Quanshi's idea of living in ignorance, further reinforces the coherence of the story. In a way, Denji sides with him. He'll decide on his own to go and fight Makima without ignoring anything about her. He won't forget what she's done wrong. He won't forget the feelings he has for her. He won't ignore any of it, because instead of taking the easy way out of ignorance, he'll keep it all in mind and act in spite of it all. And it's ultimately thanks to this that he'll succeed in defeating Makima. Because as he says in the very last chapter, by eating her, he didn't attack her but showed love, which prevented her from being resurrected according to the contract she had made with the Japanese Prime Minister. Well, Kishibe will say, to rationalize things a little, that in reality it probably worked on a stroke of luck, thanks to a bug in the contract. But still, it's thanks to the acceptance of the imperfection of his happiness as a man that Denji managed to defeat Makima. That it's thanks to this desire to surpass his own condition his better understanding of what happiness is, and his desire to live his life to the full, that Denji was able to become the new Chainsaw Man, and that, at the very end, we were able to witness the birth of a hero. The part 1 of Chainsaw Man is a sort of superhero origin story in the end. A rather special superhero to be sure, but a superhero nonetheless, the Chainsaw Man. At present we have no idea what direction part 2 will take, since we don't have a synopsis or anything, and knowing Fujimoto, it could go in just about any direction because the guy's unpredictable. But still, this analysis won't be complete anymore in a few years. In any case, I can't wait to see whether Denji will evolve further or just stay the same. I may have over-intellectualized some parts, a bit like the video on Makima. But even if we forget all that, I think Denji's character is really well written, coherent, endearing, and has a really well thought out development that brings a lot to the manga. You can tell me in the comments if you like the philosophical parts, or if it's a bit too much of an intellectual masturbation, but personally I really feel that it helps to understand what Fujimoto wanted to convey to us, whether voluntarily or unconsciously. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, so don't hesitate to subscribe, like, comment, share and so on. Come and follow me on Twitter, and we'll meet again for the next video on Chainsaw Man, which will probably be the most perched analysis video of my entire channel, where we'll try to understand the true meaning of Chainsaw Man, so you've been warned. Until next time.